I think he feels with the turmoil in the States, I think he will pace himself very, very carefully. He will watch what will happen in The Hague in June very, very carefully. And this is where we have to look at the architecture being conceived by Ursula von der Leyen, but particularly the External Affairs Commissioner, and Ursula von der Leyen, and of course Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte has some thinking going on. We know he tells us that, but we don't know what it is.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Fox, who's been a journalist for more than 50 years, during which time he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and the Falklands. He's also the author of multiple books and is the current defence editor for the London Standard. Robert, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hello, good morning.
I wanted to start by getting your reaction to this mineral deal that Ukraine has reportedly agreed with the US. Trump says he expects Zelensky in Washington on Friday to sign it. The exact terms of the deal are still somewhat unclear, but Trump has said that in return for the deal, Ukraine would get the right to fight on. I wonder if you can just help us make sense of this, Robert. What are we looking at here?
It's still very, very shadowy in outline, James. You're absolutely right, because there is misgiving in Kiev about the nature of Trump's security guarantees, given his bromance with Putin, particularly the extraordinary activities in the Security Council at the beginning of the week, where they sided up with Belarus, Iran, and North Korea in not supporting a condemnation of Russia's aggression over 3 years in the war in Ukraine. That Zelensky, who's playing a very, very low hand very well, I think, is quite clearly apprehensive about what the deal really means. One thing that really should be noted is that Trump is boasting about this deal and getting payback, etc., the art of the deal again. And of course, we had less than 24 hours before out of Moscow, the Moscow information machine, if I can put it politely like that, suggesting joint exploitation by American companies inside Russia for Russia's very rich mineral and strategic materials exploitation, which of course China wants. And of course, on top of that, sorry to return to a familiar theme with me, is the Arctic, that quite clearly that Trump and to an extent Putin, but the vision is clearer, well, it's very clear in both men's mind, is that they want to exploit the Arctic and they want to share it. And it's reminiscent in spirit of the division of the New World in the Treaty of Tordesillas at the end of the 15th century, the so-called Alexandrine line after Pope Alexander, rather miscreant Pope, it must be said, I think it was the Borgia Pope. And it was as if you could divide the world in half like that. And this is not just indulging history nostalgia just for its own sake. It does tell you what the Trump approaches, and this affects Ukraine, and it's hegemonistic, as we say, but the American jargon for it is sovereigntist. They've thought that really that to an extent, Trump, Putin and Xi had a mercantilist view, which is a very serious view of high colonial commerce across the globe, whereby you carved up chunks of the world in your own interest, as your own sphere of influence and interest and for profit. And saw the race across the world in the 18th and then the 19th century with the scramble for Africa. No, it is something more than that. We're going to claim just great blocks of the world. And this block view is very much something that Trump, Xi, because Xi doesn't want to dominate the whole world, but he wants to dominate as much of it that is in the interest of China and the Chinese People's Communist Party. And Russia, we know what Putin's view is. I mean, I'm surprised that they didn't go back when we had the security conference in Munich to his great speech in 2007, in which he declared what he thought Russia's position was in Eurasia. And I emphasize Eurasia. Now, coming back to your question, this is where, in this jigsaw puzzle, this is where the deal over strategic materials, natural elements in Ukraine really fits in. And I'm not entirely sure that Russia will go along with what Trump is proposing to get Zelensky off the hook.
Is it in Ukraine's interest to sign this deal? I mean, you can understand why Donald Trump would want access to Ukrainian mineral resources. If you're Volodymyr Zelensky, do you see it as, okay, we're giving up some of our natural resources, but in return we'll have American contractors on the ground in Ukraine, and that improves our security long term?
I think things are pretty desperate in Ukraine. From what I can see, is that coming up to the third anniversary of the war, they really could not contemplate another year of war, particularly in human resources, in material. Of course, they're holding the line. And it is quite extraordinary that Russia is not making enough gains and doesn't particularly want at this time. And this may be a clue why Putin may tolerate this, because he needs an operational pause. They need to regroup. They need to repair whatever they can of the damage to the Russian economy, which is enormous. And there is a view out of Moscow inspired, I suspect, out on X, just as we're speaking. I've been looking at it in the past hour. We've achieved our war aims. So I think that you're going to get a Panmunjom out of this. You're going to get a DMZ, as it were. You're going to get 1953 in 2025. And I'm referring to Korea, of course, where you'll have a frozen armistice. I don't hold out any prospects, if we come to that, of it lasting anything like as long as the frozen armistice in Korea, because I think either way, this, whatever's on the table at the moment, we're not seeing a conclusion to this war. We're seeing a pause at best.
I mean, that's the key point in many respects. And there's this discussion about, well, okay, if you had a DMZ, if you needed peacekeeping troops on the ground, who would they be? Would they be European troops? Would they be British? Would they be French? Would they be American? Probably not. And therefore, Robert, long term, are we heading for further conflict between Russia and European democracies? Is this heading towards an all-out war between Russia and the European democracies?
I don't think you're going to see any international or Western European troops on the ground inside Ukraine whatsoever. And I think that is a red line. And I think that there may be a reassurance and a monitoring, and I think it will be aerial. I think it will be remote. I think that if you have troops, that they will sit on the border, that they will be in Slovakia. But that's unlikely because they're not allowed. That they're very antipathetic to Zelensky currently. They may well sit in Romania and Poland. They will be light forces, nothing like the 100,000 that has been mentioned, and they will be very, very token indeed. And I suspect, as currently being mentioned amongst the Chatterati, the commentators, I think they wouldn't last for more than a few months, if that. It's looking very, very obscure, because while we're hearing a great deal of noise from the White House and from the American side, we're not quite clear. Nobody can be quite clear, even some of those in his inner circle, what Putin's scheme of maneuver is. And it is a scheme of maneuver because it won't be over until it's all over, as the great Yogi Berra was saying. And I think you're right, because I go back to my famous expression of a semi-Freddo war, that we've seen these. We've got semi-Freddo wars, things that seem to be frozen, and then they become unfrozen, and then they freeze a bit. Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, that one isn't resolved. Azerbaijan, Russia, and Iran is another one. And this is where you get a big juggling act. And it's all of a much bigger piece, I think, with Putin. That Putin will be working out, what we do with Ukraine. Ukraine is the big prize. He wants to show that Ukraine is Russian looking and not Brussels looking, let alone Washington, not that Washington particularly wants it. But how do you fit Belarus? How do you fit the Kaliningrad isolated garrison into that, Moldova, and even the Balkans, largely, much of the Balkans, and of course very much including Serbia and Montenegro, are part of the Putin sphere of influence and reference.
So therefore, Robert, do you think at some point he will make a move on mainland Europe?
I think he feels, with the turmoil in the States, I think he will pace himself very, very carefully. He will watch what will happen in The Hague in June very, very carefully. And this is where we have to look at the architecture being conceived by Ursula von der Leyen, but particularly the External Affairs Commissioner, and Ursula von der Leyen, and of course Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte has some thinking going on. We know he tells us that, but we don't know what it is. I think he's going to be a very interesting Secretary General of NATO because he knows exactly what he's got on his plate. But it's very interesting when you think the first Secretary General of NATO, who was Pug Ismay, very close confidant of Churchill, famously said the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in Europe, the Russians out, and the Germans down. All that's gone completely. But it's very, very interesting that how we are seeing a steady weakening of international institutions here. We've seen the farce in the Security Council with America siding with Russia and China. What really works? And the thing is that what we have is a lot of broken china, pardon the pun, all over the place because Putin and Trump are real smashers. And the problem with Putin, they said, oh, we'll have this deal and we can do this, that, and the other. He's never stuck to a major deal. As much as Trump, he's undone deals. He's a disruptor. But in terms of politics and ideology, which is all but absent from all of this, they're all terribly retro, the three of them, Putin, Trump, and Xi. They're looking backwards in history. In fact, I think they're quite, we've been invoking the Alan Bennett play, The Madness of King George. There is a kind of monarchy about Trump's approach, as indeed there is with Putin, always compared to a czar. And although an avowed Marxist-Leninist in theory, in practice, Xi is an old-fashioned Chinese emperor, more and more. And he works entirely, not through the assemblies. His tool is the People's Liberation Army. But the thing that is absolutely crucial is the Chinese People's Communist Party, the PCC in China. And this is what we're faced with. And Europe is very much rules-based, but it's rules-based where they become reduced to dogma and regulation. And you just see, how much the British government is wedded to legalistic argumentation and practice. It's full of lawyers, after all. I think where the get out of this situation is going to emerge, I think it's going to emerge from Macron's influence, Macron working with Starmer. Goodness knows what happens in Germany, but I do think we're underestimating politically, and they are now punching well above their weight, is what is happening with the Scandinavians. The Danes have pushed their defense budget to 3% of GDP in the last matter of months. The Dutch, peculiarly, have doubled their defense budget, having discussed halving it 20 years ago. And it's the arc from the Dutch through the Nordics, through to the Baltics, bolted onto the British and the French with the Poles, of course, but the Poles are not moving out of their own area or even their own national boundary, and for very, very good reason that they've got it right. They are absolutely on the front line of this. And it's a reenactment of a battle of borders again, which has been going on for a millennium there.
Absolutely. I mean, Vladimir Putin would take a very old-fashioned view that the edge of Russia's sphere of influence is the north of the Carpathians up to the Baltics, and that land in between is Poland. So you can understand why Poland would be so nervous. I just wonder, Robert, is there any scenario in which, with Putin, with Trump saying that, if they sign this mineral deal, he'll allow Ukraine to fight on, that if, with Friedrich Merz now in charge in Germany, with Macron increasingly hawkish, with Starmer pledging increases in defence spending, albeit probably nowhere near enough, that with European support, Ukraine could go on fighting this war?
I think the objective has got to be, the main objective, the mission for Ukraine, is not necessarily fighting the war, because that's a ways and means, and it is looking increasingly difficult. The end is simply this. It's to maintain its national sovereignty, which, after all, Russia signed up to with Britain and America in 1994 in the Budapest Accord. Whatever you say, that's what it was. Even the sort of a rather plastic Marxist left in the UK, who are now prone to arguing that it was agreed that NATO shouldn't expand its borders. Yes, that was discussed, but it wasn't signed up to. It's the sovereignty. Now, this is going to be this is at the center of the chess game, because Russia will say, yes, you can have sovereignty provided we can have influence, and you don't have influence from the West, e.g. Belarus and Georgia. And that is the way Russia will then work. It will try and erode the independence of Ukraine. This is part of Putinism. Now, it's whether Trump America, really cares a fig about Ukrainian sovereignty. And I think that is really open to question. And that is now one of the big questions now. The problem for me is the devaluation of language. And a lot of the rhetoric and exchange, and you get it from Musk and Trump and others, very intelligent men in their ways, but the language is infantile. And the Russians, the Lavrovs, not only Putin, but people like Lavrov, Peskov, the spokesman, really understand that too, and they play it very, very well, because the information offensive since Trump came back to the White House on the 20th of January, the information onslaught from Moscow has been absolutely formidable, as I can speak to from very direct personal experience.
Just finally, Robert, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has now pledged to increase Britain's defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. Is that anywhere near enough? When he meets Donald Trump this week, is Trump going to be in any way impressed by that?
Probably not. But it could be enough if it is incremental, and it could be balanced. And by the way, I think it should be balanced with the aid budget, which I think should be restored. He should pledge that by at least the halfway stage in his parliamentary term, Starmer. I mean, so 2007, we should be heading back to 4%, 5% if the economy is any good, but I doubt it. But because they go hand in hand. This is what is so unfortunate and ridiculous about it. The problem with Britain, medium long term, in an aging society, as most of European and advanced societies are, as I have pointed out continuously, is how on earth you go on spending more and more. We're already looking at over 50% of all public expenditure on health and welfare. But by the midterm, looking to 2030, it could be 60%. That cannot continue, given the shape of society, community and the economy in the UK. And so much is so in quite a bit of the rest of the world. And the real warning signs are coming up from Italy, South Korea and Japan.
Robert, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.